The late afternoon sun streamed through the airport windows as passengers hurried to catch their flights. Among them was Dr. Lee, a talented neurosurgeon, who held her 6-year-old daughter's hand as they walked through the terminal. Her medical scrubs were neatly tucked into her carry-on, replaced by comfortable travel clothes for the 3-hour flight to Chicago. Tomorrow morning, she would be performing a delicate operation that could change a young patient's life forever. "Mommy, are we going to get snacks on the plane?" her daughter asked, clutching her favorite stuffed penguin. Dr. Lai smiled, despite her exhaustion from a 12-hour shift at the hospital. "Of course, sweetie. We've got those special seats up front, remember? They'll have all your favorite juice, too." The boarding process was smooth at first. They were among the first to board, having priority access with their first-class tickets. Dr. Lai helped her daughter settle into the plush leather seat by the window, making sure her backpack was safely stowed underneath. Her daughter's eyes grew wide with wonder at the spacious cabin. It was their first time flying in first class, a treat Dr. Lai had splurged on because she knew she'd need to rest before tomorrow's demanding surgery. Other passengers filtered past them, some offering friendly smiles at the sight of the little girl excitedly pointing out everything she could see through the window. Dr. Lai checked her phone one last time, reviewing the medical files that had been sent over. The surgery tomorrow wasn't just any procedure. It was a complicated case that required absolute precision and focus. A flight attendant stopped by their seats, warmly offering them pre-flight beverages. "Apple juice for the little one?" she asked kindly, and Dr. Lee's daughter nodded enthusiastically. The moment felt perfect. Her daughter happy, their travel smooth, and everything on track for tomorrow's important surgery. But the peaceful scene was about to change dramatically. As Dr. Lai helped her daughter open her juice box, she noticed a shadow fall across their seats. Looking up, she found herself face to face with the pilot, his expression stern and his posture rigid. Something about his presence made the air in the cabin feel suddenly thick with tension. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made nearby passengers turn their heads. "There seems to be some confusion about these seats." He wasn't exactly frowning, but his face held a look of barely concealed disapproval as his eyes moved between Dr. Lai, her daughter, and their first-class surroundings. Dr. Lai felt her stomach tighten. She experienced this kind of interaction before, the subtle questioning of her presence in spaces where some people didn't expect to see her. She reached for her phone, where both their boarding passes were stored, already knowing that wouldn't be the end of it. Her daughter, sensing the change in atmosphere, stopped mid-sip of her juice and pressed closer to her mother's side. Around them, the quiet buzz of pre-flight conversation began to dim as other passengers turned their attention to the developing scene. Someone a few rows back slowly raised their phone, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The cheerful excitement of their journey was evaporating fast, replaced by a familiar tension that Dr. Lai had hoped her daughter wouldn't have to experience so young. But as she met the pilot's challenging stare, she knew this wasn't going to be the simple, peaceful flight they'd planned for. What happened next would not only change their day, but would send ripples through an entire airline and beyond. The pilot stood there, his shadow looming over their seats as Dr. Lai pulled up their boarding passes on her phone. "Here are our tickets," she said calmly, turning the screen toward him. "As you can see, we're in the correct seats." She kept her voice steady, conscious of her daughter watching every move. But the pilot barely glanced at the phone. Instead, he crossed his arms, his captain's stripes gleaming under the cabin lights. "These are premium seats," he said, emphasizing each word as if speaking to someone who might not understand English well, despite Dr. Lai's perfect pronunciation. There must be some mistake in the booking system. A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly gentleman across the aisle frowned, removing his reading glasses to better observe the situation. The flight attendant who had served them juice earlier hovered nearby, her hands nervously clasping and unclasping in front of her uniform. "There's no mistake. Dr. Lai replied, still maintaining her composure. I booked these seats specifically because I have an important surgery to perform tomorrow morning. I need to be well rested. She felt her daughter's small hand grip her arm tighter, the child's stuffed penguin forgotten on the floor. The pilot's face hardened. I'm responsible for maintaining certain standards in first class, he said, his voice carrying across several rows now. We've had issues before with booking errors. I'm sure you understand. His emphasis on standards made his meaning crystal clear to everyone within earshot. A woman 2 rows ahead turned around, no longer pretending not to listen. She held her phone at chest level, its camera lens catching the scene unfolding behind her. More phones appeared among the passengers, recording devices capturing every word of the exchange. I don't understand, actually, Dr. Lai responded, her professional demeanor still intact but with steel entering her voice. Please explain exactly what standards you're referring to. Her daughter looked up at her with worried eyes, then at the pilot, then back to her mother. The pilot shifted his weight, seemingly caught off guard by her direct challenge. This is about passenger comfort and security, he said, his words coming out clipped and harsh. I have the authority to make seating arrangements as I see fit. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the cabin. The flight attendant finally stepped forward, her face showing her discomfort with the situation. Captain, their boarding passes are valid, she said quietly. Everything is in order. But the pilot waved her off. I've made my decision, he announced, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and exit the aircraft. We can rebook you on a later flight. Dr. Li's daughter began to cry softly, big tears rolling down her cheeks. Mommy, did we do something wrong? She whispered, but her words carried in the now silent cabin. Several passengers made sounds of outrage, and the clicking of phone cameras intensified. No, sweetie, we didn't do anything wrong, Dr. Lai assured her daughter, though her own hands trembled slightly as she reached for their bags. She stood up, her full height still several inches shorter than the pilot, but somehow she seemed to tower in that moment. But we're going to leave, because someone here is making a very big mistake. The flight attendant looked close to tears herself as she helped them gather their belongings. As they moved toward the exit, other passengers began to speak up. This isn't right, someone called out. I want to file a complaint, said another. A businessman in the front row was already on his phone, apparently calling the airline's customer service. As they reached the aircraft door, Dr. Lai turned back to the pilot, who still stood by their now empty seats. You should know, she said quietly, that actions have consequences. With that, she guided her sniffling daughter up the jet bridge, leaving behind a cabin full of shocked passengers and a pilot who didn't realize he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Walking back into the terminal felt like moving through a dream. Dr. Lai held her crying daughter close as they followed the gate agent, who kept apologizing with every few steps. Behind them, they could hear raised voices from the plane they'd just left, the commotion growing louder as more passengers became involved. I want to go home, her daughter whimpered, clutching her stuffed penguin so tight its head was bent at an odd angle. Why was that man so mean to us? The question pierced Dr. Li's heart. How do you explain prejudice to a 6-year-old who still believes the world is fundamentally good? The gate agent led them to a small office just off the main terminal, where 2 more airline employees were already typing frantically at their computers. Through the office's glass walls, Dr. Lai could see a small crowd gathering. Passengers from the flight who had chosen to deplane in solidarity. This is completely unacceptable, said an elderly woman who had been sitting across from them in first class. She had followed them into the office, her designer handbag clutched tightly. I've been flying this airline for 30 years, and I've never seen such disgraceful behavior from a crew member. Dr. Lai's phone buzzed continuously. Messages from the hospital in Chicago, wondering about her delay. The young patient's family was waiting, counting on her to arrive for tomorrow's critical surgery. She tried to respond one-handed while still comforting her daughter. "Ma'am, we're so sorry," one of the airline employees said, looking up from her computer with genuine distress on her face. "We've just been informed about who you." She stumbled over her words, her face growing pale as she read the information on her screen. Just then, a man in a sharp suit burst through the office door, slightly out of breath. "Dr. Lee?" he asked, his airline executive badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "I'm the regional manager. I came as soon as I heard. This is—" He paused, looking at her daughter, and chose his words carefully. "This situation is completely unacceptable." Outside the office, the crowd had grown. Passengers were showing each other videos they'd recorded of the incident. Some were already posting on social media, their thumbs tapping away at their phones as they described what they'd witnessed. The hashtag first-class discrimination was starting to trend. "I have surgeries scheduled for the next 3 days," Dr. Lai explained, her professional calm still intact despite everything. "There's a young boy in Chicago whose life depends on tomorrow morning's procedure. I chose first class because I need to be rested and focused." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, the first sign of how deeply the incident had affected her. Her daughter had stopped crying, but sat curled in a chair, unusually quiet, watching everything with wide eyes. A flight attendant, who had also left the plane, brought her a cup of hot chocolate, trying to coax a smile. Through the glass walls, they could see the pilot striding toward the office, his face red with what looked like a mixture of anger and growing realization. The regional manager quickly stepped outside to intercept him, their heated conversation visible but not audible through the glass. "Your pilot didn't just remove a passenger today," Dr. Lai said quietly to the airline staff in the office. "He removed a chief of pediatric neurosurgery heading to perform emergency surgery. He removed a hospital board member who oversees millions in corporate contracts. But most importantly," she looked at her daughter, who was finally taking small sips of her hot chocolate, "he removed a mother and child from their rightful seats because of how we look." The airline employees exchanged horrified glances as the implications sank in. Outside, phones continued to record, social media continued to buzz, and the story was spreading faster than anyone could control. In the distance, they could hear the delayed flight being announced as canceled, as more and more passengers demanded action before they would agree to fly. The regional manager returned to the office, his face grim but determined. "Dr. Lai, if you'll allow us, we have a private corporate jet standing by. We can have you and your daughter in Chicago within 2 hours." He glanced at his watch, then back at her. "Though I hope you'll understand this is just the beginning of how we intend to make this right." The airline's corporate office was in chaos. Phone lines were ringing nonstop as news of the incident spread like wildfire across social media. The regional manager's phone buzzed again, this time with a message that made him go pale. "The patient waiting for tomorrow's surgery," he said quietly to his staff, "is the mayor's grandson." Meanwhile, in the private office, Dr. Lai was on a video call with the Chicago Hospital Board. Her daughter had finally fallen asleep on a makeshift bed made from office chairs, exhausted from the emotional ordeal. The stuffed penguin was tucked safely under her arm. "We've seen the videos," said the board chairman, his face grave on the screen. "They're everywhere. CNN is picking up the story." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "The mayor is, well, let's just say he's taking a personal interest in this situation." As if on cue, a group of reporters gathered outside the terminal office, their cameras pointed through the glass walls. The airline staff quickly lowered the blinds, but not before several flashes went off. The story was too juicy to ignore: a renowned surgeon, a racist incident, and a connection to the Chicago mayor all wrapped into one. The pilot, who had been pacing in a nearby office, suddenly stopped as his own phone lit up with notifications. Someone had recognized Dr. Lai from a medical conference and shared her professional profile online. his face drained of color as he scrolled through her accomplishments. Youngest chief of pediatric neurosurgery in the state's history, pioneer of groundbreaking surgical techniques, board member overseeing major hospital contracts, including the very airline transportation contracts his job depended on. Doctor, the regional manager said, returning from another urgent phone call, our CEO is on his way. He's ordered our corporate jet prepared. He hesitated, then added, he's also requesting copies of all passenger videos for the investigation. Outside, the crowd of supporters had grown even larger. The elderly woman who had followed them off the plane was giving an interview to a local news crew. I've never seen such blatant discrimination, she was saying, her voice carrying through the office walls. That doctor saved my grandson last year. I recognized her as soon as she boarded. She's a miracle worker with children, and this is how she's treated. Inside the office, an airline PR representative was drafting her fourth statement of the hour. Each version became more apologetic as the true scope of their predicament became clear. Not only had they discriminated against a passenger, they had discriminated against one of the most respected pediatric surgeons in the country, a key decision-maker for their corporate contracts, and the doctor scheduled to operate on a prominent political figure's family member. Dr. Lay's phone buzzed with another message. This one was from her colleague in Chicago. The waiting room is full of reporters. Someone leaked that you were removed from a flight. The mayor's office is involved now. Are you okay? Is your daughter okay? She looked at her sleeping child and typed back a simple response. We're fine. Getting there soon. Prepare the ore. No matter what chaos was unfolding around them, she remained focused on what mattered most, the young patient waiting for her help. The regional manager approached again, this time with a team of airline executives who had just arrived. Doctor, we've arranged everything. The corporate jet is ready, with a car waiting in Chicago. We'll have you at the hospital within 2 hours. He paused, choosing his words carefully. We know this doesn't begin to address what happened here today, but your patient needs you, and that's the priority right now. Dr. Lai nodded, gently waking her daughter. As they gathered their belongings, she could hear the pilot in the next room, his voice raised in protest. How was I supposed to know who she was? An airline executive responded, her voice sharp and clear through the thin walls. That's exactly the point. It shouldn't matter who she is. But since you asked, you just removed the doctor who saved your own sister's child last spring. Check your family photos. She's the surgeon in the background of your niece's hospital release day. The silence that followed was deafening. The corporate jet soared through the evening sky toward Chicago, while the story exploded across social media. Back at the airport, the airline's crisis management team huddled in their emergency operations center, watching as video clips of the incident racked up millions of views by the minute. It's the top trending topic nationwide, one social media manager reported, staring at her screen in disbelief. We're getting comments from other doctors, civil rights leaders, and celebrities. That passenger video from row 3 has already hit 5 million views. The airline's CEO had arrived on scene, his tie loosened and forehead creased with worry. He watched the viral videos play out on the wall of monitors, each showing a different angle of the same disturbing scene. How did no one recognize her? He muttered, running a hand through his gray hair. She's lectured at our corporate health seminars. She's on the board that approves our medical transport contracts. Down the hall, the pilot sat alone in a small office, scrolling through his phone in horror. His sister had just sent him a devastating text. That doctor you kicked off the plane. She performed the surgery that saved my daughter's life last year. How could you do this? Attached was a family photo from the hospital, and there in the background, smiling warmly, was Dr. Lai. Meanwhile, in the terminal, passengers from the canceled flight were still giving interviews to the growing crowd of reporters. The elderly woman who had witnessed everything hadn't left, despite missing her own connection. I watched that little girl cry, she told a news crew, her voice shaking with emotion. I watched her ask her mother what they did wrong. What kind of message are we sending to our children? The airline's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls. Other doctors began sharing their own stories of discrimination during travel. Medical associations released statements of support. The Chicago mayor's office issued a terse comment. We are watching this situation closely and expect full accountability. On the corporate jet, Dr. Lee's daughter had finally settled down, coloring in a book the flight attendant had found for her. "Mummy," she asked, looking up from her drawing, "are we still bad passengers?" The question brought tears to the eyes of the corporate flight attendant, who had been specially assigned to their flight. "No, sweetheart," Dr. Lai answered, stroking her daughter's hair. "We were never bad passengers. Sometimes people make wrong choices based on how others look, but that's their mistake, not ours." She checked her phone again. The hospital was ready for her arrival, the OR being prepared for tomorrow's early morning surgery. Back at the airport, the video clips kept spreading. Someone had pieced together Dr. Lai's professional accomplishments. Youngest chief of pediatric neurosurgery in the state, pioneer of revolutionary surgical techniques, speaker at international medical conferences. Side by side with the clips of her being forced off the plane, the contrast was striking. The pilot's past record was now under scrutiny. Other incidents emerged, complaints that had been dismissed, reports that had been buried. The airline's HR department worked frantically to compile a complete history as social media users began digging deeper. Our stock is already down 3 points in after-hours trading, the CFO reported grimly. The medical transport contract's up for renewal next month, worth over $50 million, and Dr. Lai chairs the board committee that approves them. In the crisis center, phones kept ringing. Airlines couldn't afford this kind of publicity. Not in an age where videos went viral in minutes and reputations could be destroyed in hours. The CEO reached for his phone again, knowing that no standard corporate apology would be enough this time. As the corporate jet began its descent into Chicago, Dr. Lai received one last message from a mother's advocacy group asking her to speak at their next conference. "Your dignity in the face of discrimination," they wrote, "is inspiring parents nationwide to have difficult but necessary conversations with their children about prejudice." She looked at her daughter, now sleeping peacefully, and thought about all the other children who might face similar situations. Maybe some good could come from this after all. But first, she had a young patient waiting for her help, and that would always be her priority. By morning, the story had reached international news. Dr. Lai had successfully completed the mayor's grandson's surgery, while outside the hospital, reporters gathered in growing numbers. The airline's corporate headquarters faced a crisis unlike anything they'd seen before. "The investigation is our top priority," the airline's CEO announced at an emergency press conference. Facing a wall of cameras, he looked tired but determined. "We've suspended the pilot pending a full review. This incident goes against everything our company stands for." Inside the hospital, the mayor sat in the waiting room, his face stern as he watched the news coverage on his tablet. His grandson was in recovery, the surgery a complete success, but his mind was on the larger issue. "She saved my grandson's life," he told his aide, "and just hours before, she was treated like a criminal on that plane." The pilot's suspension made headlines across the country. As investigators dug deeper, more stories surfaced. A flight attendant finally spoke up about previous incidents she'd witnessed but had been afraid to report. "He always had an excuse," she told the investigation team. But there was a pattern nobody wanted to see. At the airline's training center, all flights were paused for emergency anti-bias sessions. Flight crews gathered in conference rooms, watching the viral videos, many wiping away tears as they heard the little girls confused crying. "This could have been prevented," one trainer said firmly, "and from now on, it will be." Dr. Lee's daughter stayed with a close friend while her mother worked. The friend's phone kept buzzing with messages. Other parents wanting to know how to talk to their kids about discrimination, how to teach them to stand up for themselves and others. My mommy helps people, the little girl told her friend's mother while they baked cookies that afternoon. That mean man didn't know that, but my mommy always helps people. The simple truth in those words would later be quoted in countless articles about the incident. The airline's board of directors called an emergency meeting. The medical transport contracts were just the beginning. Their entire corporate image was at stake. We need more than just apologies, one board member insisted. We need real change. The pilot, at home under suspension, watched his career crumble around him. His sister had shared their family photo with the media, the one showing Dr. Lai in the background after saving his niece. The irony was painful. His own family members refused to speak to him, their group chat silent for the first time in years. Support poured in from unexpected places. Other medical professionals shared stories of similar experiences. A group of airline employees started a petition for better anti-discrimination training. The hospital where Dr. Lai worked was flooded with messages of support from former patients and their families. The airline's legal team worked through the night, drafting new policies. Clear guidelines, the head lawyer insisted. Zero tolerance for discrimination. Real consequences. And a proper reporting system that actually works. In the hospital cafeteria, Dr. Lai finally took a break after her successful surgery. A young nurse approached her table, hesitant but determined. "My daughter saw the video," she said softly. "She wants to be a doctor now. Because you showed her that we don't let others tell us where we belong." The airline CEO's office received another report. Their stock had dropped significantly. Corporate clients were watching closely, waiting to see how the company would handle this crisis. The board demanded immediate action, not just promises, but visible change. It's not about just one pilot or one incident anymore, the airline's head of HR explained in an emergency staff meeting. This is about changing a culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. By evening, the airline announced sweeping changes. Mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, a new passenger advocacy board, and a thorough review of all past discrimination complaints. But most importantly, they announced that Dr. Lai had agreed to help shape these new policies, turning a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for lasting change. As the day ended, Dr. Lai sat by her daughter's bed, reading her a bedtime story. "Are you still sad about the plane?" her daughter asked sleepily. "No, sweetie," she replied, hugging her close. "Sometimes bad things happen so we can help make sure they don't happen to others." 6 weeks after the incident, the airline's main training center buzzed with activity. Dr. Lai stood at the podium, her daughter sitting proudly in the front row, as she addressed a room full of airline staff. The company's new anti-bias training program was launching, and she had been asked to share her story. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she told the quiet room, "but it happens one decision at a time." The flight attendant who had served them juice that day was now part of the new passenger advocacy team, turning her regret into action. The pilot had been officially terminated after the investigation revealed a history of similar incidents. But more importantly, the airline had completely overhauled its complaint system. "We found 17 past complaints that had been ignored," the HR director explained in a press conference. "That stops today." In the hospital, things had changed too. Dr. Lee's daughter came to work with her one afternoon and noticed something new. A colorful poster in the staff room about standing up against discrimination. "Look, Mommy," she said excitedly, "they're teaching grown-ups to be nice." The airline's new scholarship program was making headlines. Full rides for minority students pursuing medical degrees. Inspired by Dr. Lee's courage, the press release read, "We're investing in a future where every professional is judged solely by their capabilities." Other companies took notice. Airlines across the country began reviewing their own training programs. Dr. Lee's phone rang constantly with invitations to speak at corporate events, but she remained focused on what mattered most, her patients and her daughter. The elderly woman who had supported them that day on the plane became a regular volunteer at the hospital. "That little girl reminded me of my granddaughter," she told other volunteers. I couldn't stay silent then, and I won't stay silent now. In the airport terminal where it all began, a new training video played for staff members. It showed real examples of discrimination and taught employees how to recognize and stop it. If you see something wrong, the video explained, you have not just the right, but the responsibility to speak up. Dr. Lee's daughter's school invited her to speak at an assembly about standing up for what's right. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, listening intently as she explained in simple terms why everyone deserves respect. "My mommy says we're all the same inside," her daughter added proudly during the Q&A session. The airline's corporate contracts were renewed, but with new conditions: regular audits of their anti-discrimination policies and proof of staff training completion. Other companies followed suit, creating a ripple effect across the industry. One morning, as Dr. Lai walked through the airport for another business trip, a young security officer stopped her. "My daughter saw your story," she said quietly. "Now she wants to be a doctor too. Thank you for showing her it's possible." The airline's new passenger advocacy board, which Dr. Lai now headed, received hundreds of letters. Some shared similar experiences, others offered support, but most importantly, many reported positive changes they'd noticed in recent flights. At home, Dr. Lee's daughter added a new page to her scrapbook: newspaper clippings about the changes her mother helped create, alongside a photo of them both smiling on their most recent flight. "We're making the world better," she said as she pasted in another article. The final page of the airline's new training manual included a simple quote: "Our differences make us stronger, but our humanity makes us equal." Below it, a reminder: every passenger has a story, every person has value, and everyone deserves respect. As Dr. Lai tucked her daughter into bed that night, the little girl asked a question that brought tears to her eyes. "Mommy, did we help make things better for other people?" Looking at her daughter's hopeful face, Dr. Lai smiled and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most important changes." The stuffed penguin that had witnessed it all sat on a shelf nearby, watching over a child who had learned early that standing up for what's right, even in difficult moments, could help change the world, one small action at a time.